Okay, I thank you very much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. This is my first, I guess, formal opportunity to speak as a Toda Senior Research Fellow, and it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. I do, though, have the special honor of being the last speaker on the back of quite some incredibly insightful and informative, but I must say rather anxiety-increasing presentation. So I will try my best to offer some, it's about climate change and conflict, so I may be limited in how much I can achieve this, but I will try my best to bring some hope to this conversation. I promise, though, that I will not make any references to US, its current leader, and I will try to reflect on some of the things that we can do as people in this room, as the research community, as a policy community, and even as individuals, so that we don't leave the room feeling really quite disempowered. Or feel more empowered than we did when we came in, I hope. Okay, so 2024, if we look backwards, it did present us with unprecedented levels of climate impact, and at the same time, we saw more war than ever before in the post-World War II era. But that said, if we recognize the links between climate change, peace, and conflict, this actually offers an incredible opportunity, because the impact of climate change and conflict, this isn't just a correlation. It's not just that these two things are happening at the same time. They're interrelated, and they're also mutually reinforcing. So if we understand these linkages, how climate change impacts compound the drivers of conflict, and how conflict makes it much harder to address climate impacts, we can get a much better insight into what to do about this. The flip side, of course, of this mutual reinforcing nature of climate and conflict is that peace interventions and sustainable development and sustainable environmental practices are thus also mutually reinforcing. So this really gives us an opportunity, a very clear opportunity for building peace. So I'd like to talk to you today about how building climate resilience actually presents this opportunity for building peace. And I'll do so by first setting out some of the pathways through which climate change affects conflict. And then I'll share some thoughts about what we can do about these. But to start with, this is not the order of my slides, but okay. Okay, there we go. To start with, why are we talking about this? When we look at climate change impacts, we know that climate impacts are global, but these impacts are not affecting everybody equally. They're if we look at not just the impact of climate change, but people's vulnerability to climate impacts, if we ranked these countries and we took the top quartile, we'll find that the most vulnerable, the 70 most vulnerable countries are also in the top quartile of most fragile countries. So these communities are not just facing climate impacts, but they're also facing this double vulnerability of climate change and conflict. Here's another view. So of all the countries receiving UN peacebuilding funding, so I'm using UN peacebuilding funding as a very loose proxy for fragility. I don't know how well you can see this, but essentially we can see that almost all of these are highly sensitive to climate change. So they're in red and orange. Very few are green. Green means not so affected by these climate impacts. So this slide is mapping climate vulnerability of countries facing conflict, fragility, and political instability, and almost all of them are highly vulnerable to both. I chose this metric of financing, of peace financing, because we're in a world now where we have less money to do a lot more. There's more and more crises, and it's really helpful to follow the money. And if we follow the money, just looking at where peace building, where stabilization and conflict response money is going, they're basically going to places which are already climate vulnerable. So when it comes to peace building and stabilization operations, if you're a donor, you literally can't afford to ignore climate change in these contexts, because it's so much a part of the context. It's part of the problem. ignoring it would not make for any kind of sustainable peace. So what do we do about this? It's really helpful then to understand how climate change affects the peace, how it can compound conflict and it can hinder peace, because if we understand this, we can try to redress it. Before I go into the pathways, it's worth noting that these risks that climate change poses to peace and security are not hypothetical. They're not just academic risks. They're not just risks for the future. They're current. They're already playing out. They're based on a lot of evidence. And it's not simply something for the future. It's really important to be thinking about this now, to understand these impacts now, to be able to anticipate them so that we can build this into conflict prevention measures and sustainable development measures, to be able to do no harm, to make sure our climate action and development and humanitarian efforts, but also peace building and stabilization, does no harm to inadvertently increase climate resilience risks or increase the risk of conflict, to prevent these risks where possible, and when we don't get it right, to be able to respond when we're too late. So the first pathway is that climate impacts affects competition and conflict, can increase the risk of conflict over natural resources, things like land, water, forests. So the impacts of drought or intense rainfall, etc., can alter access to and availability of these natural resources, which are particularly sensitive to any kind of changes in temperature or precipitation linked to climate change. And this can fuel competition and tensions and can contribute to violence if, and it's a very important if, natural resource and conflict management institutions don't work properly. And it's really important that we understand it's about the governance and the ability of these institutions to manage the variability and change which climate change is bringing about. I'd like to stress that it's not about shortage. It's not about scarcity per se. It's about where changes in climate change affect the access to resources which may have already been inequitable. For example, where climate change entrenches already unfair structures which granted access to grazing rights to one ethnic group over another, or access to a certain water point to one religious community over another. So it can really compound the structural unfairness. It can also compound the risk of violence when conflict perhaps has made traditional dispute resolution mechanisms no longer viable. And so this means that there's an increase in these disputes being resolved through violence when formal or informal mechanisms are no longer in place. The second pathway is that climate impacts can undermine livelihoods, and this can affect human mobility and in some cases push people into illegal coping mechanisms, things like criminality, organized crime, armed groups, adverse climate impacts on jobs, particularly primary sector jobs like agriculture, fishing, things that depend on land and water, are especially susceptible. And this can, as people's ability to earn a living in these climate-affected livelihoods becomes more and more strained, people might look to move or look to alternatives. And when they move to places which are also resource scarce, or even if they're not resource scarce, but the host communities are not receptive to them, this can create tensions. We can see these kind of livelihoods and alternative negative coping mechanisms playing out in places like Afghanistan, where we're seeing an increase in farmers moving to opium production, or in Somalia, where there's more illegal charcoal production, or small-scale and artisanal mining in places like Sudan, which are actually very effective climate resilient livelihoods. However, are also degrading the environment by, chopping down trees and mining in ways that promote land degradation. So are in fact compounding the risks that people are looking to move away from. Gender norms play a role across all of these pathways that I'm talking about, but especially in this one. Who migrates for work? Who stays behind? Also the role of masculinities as people's livelihoods are being affected. These can shape recruitment into armed groups, can shape people's vulnerabilities as they move and maybe living in informal settlements and being brought into criminal groups. And it's really important to look at all of this through a gender lens. The third pathway is about how climate change impacts can contribute to food, extreme food price spikes and food insecurity. Perhaps the most well-documented example of this is the climate-related violence or the climate-related insecurity, food insecurity around 2007 through to 2011. Climate change was a contributory factor here. And it contributed to rising food prices, which caused a lot of unrest and physical violence in countries around the world. And we see this at not just a state level, but also at very localized levels, as declining rural incomes affect poverty, affect vulnerability, really making these poorer communities much more susceptible to being kind of politicized by opposition parties or armed groups. And also really can fuel grievances against the current administrations who are not able to safeguard people's food security. So here you can see the pathway mapped out, the impacts of climate change on agriculture, decreasing the harvest and increasing prices, which then contributes to more food volatility of food price and food supply. And this is especially problematic in countries which are very dependent on imports, particularly when there's not a clear way of getting in enough foreign exchange to be able to buy food imports. And this really puts national governments under a lot of strain to be able to maintain food prices. And when they can't, when they remove subsidies, for example, we see a lot of political unrest, as we saw across the MENA region some years ago. The fourth pathway is around extreme weather events and how this can really directly challenge government effectiveness and its legitimacy. Basically, the impacts of climate change can challenge governments if they fail or they're seen to not meet the basic role of government, which is to safeguard the physical security of its people. If they can't meet the needs of people in the aftermath of a climate-related disaster, this can really undermine legitimacy. I'll say the flip side of this is that when a government is seen to effectively respond, a government or even a non-state, a non-government actor, we saw this in Aceh post-tsunami, when a non-state group is able to step up and really provide governance and address this in an equitable way, this can really legitimize an entity, and this can be both positive and negative. We're also seeing this in a lot of non-state armed actors in like the Lake Chad region, where we see Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa province offering basically disaster relief and climate loans for people to restart livelihoods, filling this governance vacuum and building people's resilience to climate risks, winning hearts and minds. So it's not ideological, but it's an opportunity for addressing some governance gaps by various actors. The final pathway is not to do with climate change, but our own actions. The unintended consequences of poorly designed climate responses can carry their own risks. So if they're not thinking about some of the specific contextual needs of communities and some of the knock-on consequences, if climate change is designed without thinking about how an intervention might benefit one community and not another community and create inequality between, for example, IDPs and the host communities by providing IDPs food aid and water and not the host communities, or even if peace building and stabilization efforts are not taking account of climate resilience and doing things in a very climate blind and environmentally insensitive way, this can also be very harmful and can carry their own risks, which can be destabilizing. I will skip this in the interest of time and then just finish up with some entry points, some opportunities. So understanding these pathways actually gives us the answers. It might seem quite depressing because there's pathways to all the bad stuff, but they also give us the entry points as to what to do to tackle these joint risks of climate change and conflict. It means that it shows us that by addressing some of these things jointly, they can really yield this double dividend of peace and climate resilience. And in a world where these resources are really being crunched, it makes business sense, essentially. It shows that you can do more with less. It's the argument to donors in this space is that if you make sure your climate action is conflict sensitive, you can ensure that it does no harm to conflict and can promote peace. If your peace building and stabilization is climate security risk informed, it can actually promote climate resilience. So you can really ensure that one of the few areas of international assistance that's still flowing and is unlikely to stop flowing in the next few years, even if I said I wouldn't mention this, okay. Even if certain countries pull out of the Paris Agreement, this will still continue, and the flow that it's one of the largest financial flows of aid to fragile states. This really carries a lot of opportunity to address peace through the climate finance aid architecture. So what I'd like to say is I don't want to generalize, because anybody that works on peace knows that there's very little that we can get from generalized responses, but I've been lucky enough to work on over 43 countries, and there are some broad principles that can be generalizable principles when it comes to how to effectively address climate security risks through a peace building and peace making lens. Essentially, this is about building community resilience to be able to better cope with variability. It's not about addressing specific climate impacts in a technical way. It's about understanding what makes people vulnerable or what reduces their resilience to these. It's often about a lack of social cohesion. It's about a lack of trust. It's about poverty. It's about marginalization. These are all the same drivers of conflict. So it's about understanding those root causes of vulnerability, which are essentially the same for both vulnerability to climate risk and vulnerability to conflict. And I'll just finish with 4 very quick steps that kind of illustrate this. One is around addressing governance issues and building social cohesion within climate resilience measures. Both inclusive and effective governance and social cohesion are really key to coping with shocks and stresses such as conflict and climate change. In addition, these can also mitigate factors that can drive conflict and the impacts of climate change. It's especially important for groups that were previously marginalized. And often these are the groups that are first to be drawn into kind of recruitment into armed groups or into criminality or into kind of support for opposition groups. And when they're included in decision-making over natural resource management, for example, this can really promote a strengthening of a social contract, as well as building social cohesion between these communities, these marginalized communities, and the rest. The second is around the need for and the value of better integrated analysis. So looking at climate change and conflict together. It's key to really properly understand and identify the specific ways in which climate risks play out in a specific context, really understanding the dynamics of a conflict at a very localized level, not overlaying a climate map and a conflict map and seeing where they kind of overlap and putting a red dot there, but rather looking at the interactions, who is affected and how. So really promoting integrated and contextualized climate fragility analysis. The third is around focusing on opportunities that already exist around natural resource management as an entry point to conflict and peace building. It's an existing enabling environment. Sometimes when all political avenues are shut down, climate and environment presents a space. It's often seen as a bit technical, a little bit apolitical. It's a shared enemy. It often leaves a space for dialogue and mediation between groups that wouldn't talk about grievances more directly. And the fourth and final one is around supporting sustainable livelihoods and livelihood diversification, improving the sustainability of livelihoods and providing alternative forms of livelihood that are more climate resilient can be a really effective way of kind of bolstering people's climate resilience, but it can also address the economic drivers of conflict, as well as kind of promoting people's feeling of better being taken care of by local or national government, because their economic options are being addressed. So I just wanted to share these more practical examples. I know it's really bringing it down to a very granular level after the conversations we've had, but I hope that this leaves us feeling like there are some tangible things that can be done in this very constricted and challenging environment that we're facing. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.